I'm sure people who are going to be watching this video at this point um, are outraged at what they're hearing about what your family endured, and here your sister Jennifer and Lou, your daughter, is not the same, is permanently injured because of what they did to her, and put your family through hell. It took you 16 months to get her back, and then of course your focus is on trying to help her get well. And it's great to hear that she's made improvements in a lot of areas, even though we understand clearly that they have done irreparable harm. And so so you sued them. Tell me about that. What happened with the lawsuit?
So yes, we filed a suit against Boston Children's Hospital, along with three doctors and one psychologist. And because you got to pick you can't sue the world. You got to pick, and even to limit to the four was not easy for us to.
There's so many.
Because there's so many people. There was physical therapists, occupational therapists that heard her consistently. There was a lot of other folks that were, but you can't sue everybody, because then that just opens the floodgates. Because even as we learned, suing one doctor for medical malpractice, and we also sued for civil rights violations, is one thing. But when you sue four doctors, four physicians, then you've got to worry about the potential jurors thinking that, wait a minute, one doctor doing something wrong, but how could you get four doctors to do something wrong? So it's another mountain that you have to climb. But we said this has to stop, because this has been a consistent pattern that they've done there, that they know how to work the system and so forth. So, and ultimately the case involved two parts. Part A was that they wrongfully took our daughter, and they abused their powers as what's called mandated reporters, which are given immunity, but you're not given immunity if you lie or exaggerate, which is what they did. And then the second half was, once they had her, the damage they did to her, and specifically putting her on the psychiatric inpatient lockdown floor, and what they did to her.
Without an inpatient diagnosis, kept her pretty much isolated and different from any other patient or on the floor, and held her there for a significant amount of time, which during that whole thing, there was a thing on, I believe on 60 Minutes, saying that people that need the inpatient level of care can't get it. And all they can get is a 48-hour hold in an emergency room. And here it is, my sister didn't even need it. And I don't even know how they could keep her there with that. It's just so messed up. Mm-hmm. And they also kept education away from her. They violated her IEP from the town of West Hartford. So that's a whole nother component to the whole thing as well.
But without getting into all the nitty-gritty of the trial, it was all the pre-trial motions, everything had been moving in our favor. But once we got to the trial, it was a new judge, former medical malpractice defense attorney, somebody who defends doctors. We saw the scales of justice were slanting away from us towards them. And they were, the four doctors had two different teams, because three doctors had one law firm, the other one had another. So it was always two against one. Mm. But the main attorney was well known throughout the country as like one of the top defenders of physicians for medical malpractice. But she was just brutal, nasty. I alone was on the witness stand 2.5 days. Incredible. Which was, and just, they were brutal. They were just trying to break you. Every one of our witnesses, they went after, from our own physicians to anybody else, they just went after. And, unfortunately, we saw that we were just hoping that the jurors would see through what they were doing. Yeah, they spared no expense, but pretty much everybody they brought in
Had
had connections to Boston Children's. Like just to give one example, so their person to help to represent the psychiatry world was the co-author with the director of Boston Children's Hospital Psychiatry of that pediatric somatoform. Nice British-speaking gentleman from Stanford University in California. So, and it was every one of them was, and they were paid big bucks. You know that, and it's just a long battle and again, we hope that we could get through this.
So 6 weeks later, after the trial, how did it end?
6 hours of deliberating, the jurors came up with
ruled, and they
only deliberated for 6 hours after all that time, which is a little alarming as well. But
it wasn't unanimous because Massachusetts doesn't require that. But
really,
yes, they ruled and all across the board in their favor. But we found out afterwards, because some of the jurors were very upset with what happened. Some reached out to the media, some reached out to our attorneys. One of the things that came up was one of the jurors felt that if we found those doctors guilty of abuse of their power, that other doctors might be fearful to report patients that might actually be doing medical child abuse, which was garbage. One of the things that tied a lot of this case together wasn't the medical records. It was the emails between the doctors and the hospitals and things.
A doctor actually noted in the emails to not document stuff into her medical records. The emails alone had all the evidence to prove this case, besides seeing my sister and hearing from my sister what happened to her.
And even though it wasn't in the judge's instructions to not include the emails, somehow in the jury room, in the deliberation room, they thought they were not allowed to include the emails as part of their evidence. So there's just
one of the jurors came forward and said that, or a couple, I don't know exactly the count, but to my knowledge, generally jurors don't come forward after a trial. One of the jurors was saying how upset she felt that Justina truly did not get justice, that they weren't looking at this for Justina. Like it was
going after the parents, us and my wife Linda. It was going after our doctors. It was going after just bashing and going after, and
they lost sight of what truly this was all about. So
and like I said, we had 4 witnesses that were not allowed to testify. There's
unbelievable.
So we have to now move on, because we can't change what happened. So we're now looking at all our options of what we can do. The appeal process is a minimum of 2 years. And then if you win your appeal, then guess what? You get a brand new trial. And so
she's not the only one.
So we have to look at what are all the options that we have. And so one of the things, like we've been trying to do all along, is we've got to change the laws. We've got to make it so that
there's no loopholes in the system for them to get away with this type of crap to hurt people.
And to change the incentive of reporting kids to DCF to have lab rats for their experiments.
Let's go through that kind of step by step. And that's when I met you back 2014, 2015, I can't remember.
Yeah, it was shortly. I believe it was 2014. It was like in the end of September or something like that.
Yeah. And Justina's law had already been drafted as legislation. And I remember
Bachman started it.
Michelle Bachman carried that for you. And the reason why, just the horrendous story of what you all have gone through is enough. But the fact is that you're not the only ones, are you?
No, it's happening.
Justina's case to the moment has been the longest and the worst, but there's other cases that have gone on and are currently going on.
I'm working with them.
Yeah, I mean, my wife Linda's been kind of the, I guess, the main advocate, because people reach out to us by email, they call about it.
Contact me through the Facebook page for Justina.
So we've helped people in a number of states across the country, including your state of Minnesota. We'll leave the name we did, and it's sad. It's that these people, they feel like they don't have a person behind them at all.
We know how that feeling was. It's scary.
You know,
So I haven't looked at the legislation that was introduced in a while. So can you give me the for the benefit of people watching this video, you know, what was the core steps of that Justina's law, if that legislation were to be reintroduced? What will it do?
So the big thing was to stop incentivizing hospitals to report people to DCF so they can get their free funding.
So
if we can,
so Justina's law prohibits the use of federal funds to conduct or support treatment or research involving a ward of the state in which the individual's health is subjected to greater than minimal risk with no or minimal prospect or of direct benefit, is what it says in the language. It was HR 4989, Justina's law.
And so, Jennifer, this gets back to what you had said earlier, that when a child, you know, if my kid is in the hospital, they can't just do all kinds of research on him. But if a child is the ward of the state, by law, they can. Correct?
Yeah, so this is that language taking that out of Health and Human Services guidelines to protect these kids out there that will have, and some of these, if they end up being a ward of the state, they don't have to tell the families, anybody, that they're doing all this nonsense to them.
So the goal of this law is to pull NIH funding, which is the lifeblood for all these hospitals. So if they violate it and their funding is removed, that's going to hit them where it hurts the most. So we don't want to stop doctors from being mandated reporters, but we want to stop them from lying.
Or if there is research with people that are freely letting themselves be a part of it, not being pulled into it with no say and taken away from their loving families just so they could be used as guinea pigs.
There has to be protection for
right now,
for minors, for children, and for parents, and for parental rights. You just can't be violating that in the name of research. You know, I mean, you just can't.
Because if
it's
anybody
fundamentally wrong.
Because if anybody who's dealt with DCF, again, it's a slanted legal system, whether it's for medical child abuse or whatever that DCF takes your child. The juvenile court system is, part of my French, it's ass backwards. You're guilty until proven innocent.
Like when Justina's whole situation happened, there was no medical director for the state of Massachusetts. I wasn't sure if it was just for Boston. So the medical director that was standing in place for it was Boston Children's Hospital. So of course that's corrupt right there.
Right.
And the judge just always leaned on Boston Children's, you know, for their advice. And then, you know, they blocked even Connecticut DCF out, who we asked.
We had to beg for Connecticut DCF to come out and investigate us.
Your story is the risk to every parent. You know, it's every parent is at risk because you didn't do anything wrong. So that means that any parent loving their child, caring for their child, wanting the best for them, going into some of these institutions is at risk for this kind of abuse. And so if we focus on this federal legislation that you know previously was referred to as Justina's law, and why not, but the key is as you had described, you know, not allowing them to do research on a ward of the state. I think, you know, why can't this be a movement? why can't we gather, you know, people from across the country who are outraged at this kind of abuse of children, abuse of parental rights, and let's see if we can build that movement by getting the word out about Justina's, about the legislation to that needs to be now introduced again into Congress, and see if we can get people talking to their congressmen at their state level and telling them that they want them to support this legislation. So I know you're planning to go to Washington soon and meet with people there. And so I think that for those of you watching this video, you know, get in touch with us at the Child Protection League or with the Pelletiers on on Justina's Facebook page. And Jennifer, you can give us that web page and Facebook page in a minute, and let them know that you are willing to help get the word out to your legislator, your congressman or congresswoman, that you want them to support this kind of legislation. This stuff isn't going to change unless we have a grassroots movement coming from the people demanding children be protected and demanding that parental rights be respected. Is there more that you would like to see in that law?
It's not so much in the law. There's one thing I'd like to help people with, because we've learned this from just the experiences we had and been talking to people across the country. Because it's a sad thing when you've got a child who, say, gets hurt, falls, does something, and you bring them to the emergency room. And then all of a sudden you might be thinking that you're bringing your child to get checked out, and they might be checking you out to see if you hurt that child. So we've seen people being afraid to bring their own children to the ER. So the one thing we encourage people, it's not always possible, if you have to bring a child to the emergency room when there's been an injury, try to make sure both parents are there.
Or you don't go alone.
Or just don't go alone. It's the single parent bringing that child to the ER with an injury. I'm not saying you go in there when you've got the flu or something else. That's different. You go in there with an injury, try to make sure you don't go there alone, because those seem to be the most vulnerable people they've been going after. And again, it's, you know, it's whatever, the 2 cents worth of advice, but it might save you $1 million of headache afterwards. And unfortunately, it's sad that that's happening, but from an emergency room standpoint, they're on the lookout for this stuff, and they might wrongfully, as they've done, you know, pick on people that, you know, was innocent. It was, the child fell off a couch or did something, and they're saying that you know, maybe you pushed a child or you did something, and all of a sudden they're bringing in DCF.
Or you neglected your child.
Or you neglected, and then away you go. So until the law changes in a number of things, people just have to be a little bit more, you know, vigilant about what they're doing to avoid because like I said, you don't want to get into this DCF court system, because it's
corrupt.
It's corrupt. It's a mess. The judges really lean towards the DCF attorneys, and if it's a medical situation, and the hospital, not the parent and your own team, and so forth. So yes, while we're going to push to get this legislation through, both, you know, at the Senate and congressional level, but we're also going to try to see if we can get, you know somebody, you know, that's inside the executive branch to assist this, so we can try to hit it from 2 angles.
Right.
And like I keep saying, this is something that crosses all party lines. This is nothing conservative or liberal. This is something just about basic human rights.
In your experience, there really aren't organizations out there to help parents when they're stuck in these situations, are there? I mean, I know that the legal side is even different, but just how to navigate through the medical aspect of this kind of nightmare. Unfortunately, I mean, I think it's still the case today, but that was the case for you, correct? I mean,
so every state has a child advocate that you would think is somebody that's going to be an advocate for you should something happen. But I always go back to who's paying that person's position, that state that they're in.
Like we put reports to the child advocate's office, to the ethics. There's everything's tied right back to.
Just like in a juvenile court case, they bring in a guardian ad litem. Who's paying that person? That state's, system. So
It's a tangled
they're not
web.
gonna bite the hand that's feeding them. So they're more times than not, they're gonna lean towards them. So again, just little bits of advice to help people until we can change, things. There needs to be a powerful, ultimately Parental Rights Act that hasn't passed in Congress yet. I don't know why. It was actually asked to testify. It was subpoenaed to testify about 5 years ago. And that act, just like the Justina law, is just sitting in limbo.
Mm-hmm.
These are not difficult acts for our Congress to pass, but they haven't.
Mm-hmm.
And
But that's our priority, right? That's
those two bills.
You have to do
Yeah.
step one, and then one thing will lead to another. You can't, unfortunately, do everything all at once. It's the little things that will build up everything.
Right. Well, I think we want to keep people informed about where this legislation is going, and we'll certainly do that at the Child Protection League. And Jennifer, give the Facebook page and the website.
So on Facebook, the page, it's A Miracle for Justina. There's also a group that's still standing, which is Free Justina from Boston Children's Hospital. And if anybody would like to donate to Justina's horseback riding and things that she does, there's a PayPal set up, and the website that's associated with that is justiceforjustina.com.
Great.